Hi guys, welcome back to Econ Time with SK. So grab your notebooks, your favorite cup of coffee, and let's get started. As mentioned in the previous video, we are going to continue our discussion about interpreting cross elasticity of demand. Specifically, we're going to be dealing with substitutes in this video. So let's say that the cross elasticity of demand, you calculate it and it comes out to be positive 2.89. As discussed earlier, this plus sign tells you that the goods that you are dealing with, they are substitutes. And there's a separate interpretation for this number, right? So first, let's spend a bit of time understanding why we're calling them substitutes when we see plus sign. Well, remember that the formula for the cross elasticity of demand is equals to percentage change in demand for good B due to a percentage change in price. And so the sign comes from watching how these two variables move. Since they're moving in the same direction, that tells us that we're dealing with substitutes. How so? Well, we are showing that price of good A, let's say the price of good A goes up. Then the demand for good B also goes up. To understand the relationship, we need to see what's happening behind the scenes. So when good A becomes more expensive, the quantity demanded for good A goes down, which means that people switch away from A towards B. This means that we are dealing with substitutes. A similar argument can also be used when we are dealing with price of good A falling, which means demand for good B would be moving in the same direction. To figure out the relationship, we look at what's happening behind the scenes. So quantity demanded for good A would of course go up by the law of demand. So the idea is of course that when good A becomes cheaper, consumers of good A start buying more of good A. So essentially what they're doing is they're switching away from B towards A. So at the end of the day, moves in the same direction, we are dealing with substitutes. Notice that when we're talking about moving in the same direction or the opposite direction, we're talking about only those two variables that are present in the formula. So demand for good B and price of good A. Demand for good B, price of good A. These are the arrows we are concerned with, which direction they're moving. Now, get back to the rest of the interpretation. What does this number tell us? For this, we need to look at the number line, right? And we know that anytime the CED is more than 1, we're dealing with elastic cross elasticity of demand. And if it is less than 1, we are dealing with inelastic CED. So of course, 2.89 is greater than 1, which means we are dealing with elastic CED, which essentially means that demand for good B is very responsive to change in price of good A, and the fact that it is very responsive tells us that we are dealing with very strong substitutes, right? And that is why the minute the price of good A goes up, people can easily switch to the substitute, which means they're almost interchangeable, and thus we're calling them very strong substitutes. Let's think of an example, okay? So let's say that in our local market, we've got a lot of companies selling biscuits, and one biscuit is as good as the others, right? You have no specific fascination towards only one of them. So let's say we're talking about cookies that are made by Hawk versus cookies that are made by Bran. So the idea being that if the price of Huck biscuits were to go up, the demand for Bran biscuits would skyrocket like this, okay? And that basically means, of course, behind the scene, we have the scenario where quantity demanded for Huck is going down. And the idea is that because they're such good substitutes, as people reduce their consumption of Huck, they really step up the consumption of prawn biscuits. So this huge response essentially reflects the fact that prawn is a very strong substitute for huck, and that explains why the cross elasticity of demand is such a high value at 2.89.
So now let's take the alternate case. So let's say you calculate the cross elasticity of demand and it comes out to be plus 0.42. Okay, so as already discussed, this plus sign simply means that we are dealing with substitutes. What we are concerned with is this number. Okay, and this number, because it is less than 1, we know that it is inelastic cross elasticity of demand, which essentially means that the demand for good B not very responsive to change in price of good A. So if we use the arrows, what it means is that if the price of good A was to go up, the demand for good B would also go up, but by a much smaller proportion. Okay, so the response is much less. Now this implies, so of course, as we discussed earlier, what is happening behind the scenes is, of course, the quantity demanded for good A, it is going down. So the fact that consumers are buying more of good B because they're switching away from good A, this tells us that we are dealing with substitutes, right? But the idea here is that because the response in the demand for good B is much less than whatever was the change in price of good A, we would say that they are weak substitutes. Can you think of an example where there are substitutes but there are other weak substitutes? Well, think about Samsung phones and iPhones. All right. Now, both companies actually do excellent branding, right? And remember, I've taught you that the concept of branding is that you give the consumers a perception that there's no alternative to your particular brand, okay? So even though both of these goods, they are phones, because they have done successful branding, consumers tend to be very loyal to one or the other. So now, if we take the case that price of Samsung is going up, the demand for iPhones, we will see, is going to go up as well, but it's going to go up by a very small amount. This is because when the price of Samsung goes up, the quantity demand for Samsung goes down a bit, but it doesn't go down that much, right? So some of these people, they end up switching to iPhone, but most of them stick to consuming Samsung. Okay, so that is why we end up getting a cross elasticity of demand, which is a pretty small number. What did I say it was? I said that it was 0.42, which we know is less than 1. So thus we're dealing with weak substitutes. And with that, we end our discussion on how we should go about interpreting the cross elasticity of demand. So just a quick recap. Always remember that the sign is going to tell you whether you're dealing with a substitute or a complement. And the number itself, that is, you're going to check if it is more than 1 or less than 1. More than 1 means you're dealing with elastic CED. And less than 1 means you are dealing with inelastic CED. Okay, so with that, we are done with the cross elasticity of demand. And in the next video, I am going to be discussing the income elasticity of demand.
Alright guys, I shall see you in the next video. Take care. Bye.